everybody, and welcome. It's really great to see from that poll a range of artistic mediums represented there, a particularly creative delegation, I think. And it's really great to see you all here representing different areas of arts education. This has, of course, been a challenging year. A lot of learners have missed out on the creative output that they get from their education as schools closed. The arts have been somewhat put to one side. We've even heard suggestions that professional artists should consider retraining. The message to learners and teachers is perhaps that the arts isn't seen as viable or valuable, but we've seen the importance of creativities throughout the lockdown. People gathered on balconies to sing, children painted rainbows for the NHS, and everybody took great comfort in the creative pursuits or products of creativity, whether learning an instrument or watching a drama on Netflix. There's an ever-growing body of empirical research which demonstrates the beneficial impact of artistic pursuits on well-being, development, and wider academic achievement. And indeed, in the UK, the arts is one of our most valuable industries. So while we often hear of late about this supposed dichotomy between health and economics, the arts are hugely important for both of these things to flourish. So I'd like to welcome you all. We've got 5 presentations today with time for questions, and we'll also have some time for an open discussion on arts education at the end. So I'd like to introduce our first presenter today, which is So the presenters today, we've got Laura Louise Nicklin, Research Fellow at the University of Wolverhampton, Lindsay Ibbotson, Honorary Research Fellow at Durham University, Carol Wild, MA Programme Lead at the University of Warwick, and Sophie Ward, who's Associate Professor at Durham University, and Egil Rakashiva, who's Research Assistant at Kazakhstan Educational Research Association. So we've got some presentations here from varied aspects of arts education throughout the country and abroad, and we're all very pleased to welcome you here today. So on to our first presentation.
Do you want me to start, Adam?
Sorry, I was. I think we've got a poll first.
Oh. Okay, apparently can't see me, but I hope you can hear me.
Oh yeah, sorry about that. Okay, so first of all, we're welcoming Carol Wild. So over to you, Carol. Thanks.
Thank you, and thanks for your response to the poll. Does it make a difference if an arts teacher is a specialist or not? And I think particularly at secondary level, but also primary too. It's actually a very complex question. It starts off seeming to be simple, but it's a complex question that has implications for what we expect of teachers, how their time is allocated, and most importantly, I think, the kind of professional development that we see as being valuable. And it's perhaps a question that's asked with differing intensity in relation to different subject specialisms. And I'm exploring this question and have been for several years within the field of arts education, within art and design specifically, responding to a kind of ideal art teacher that's kind of emerged in the art education world regarding art education practice that's been influential in the UK over the last 20 years, largely thanks to a scheme initially supported by Arts Council England and the National Society for Education, Art and Design called the Artist Teacher Scheme, or the ATS. And I was responsible for running a regional ATS scheme for many years. But it's also an ideal that you can see informs initial teacher training and art teacher CPD in other international contexts, such as Australia, Canada, the Netherlands, the States, and Spain. And my starting point in addressing the question of does it make a difference, and if it does, how, was to go back to the published research about the Artist Teacher Scheme, which I've kind of felt framed the idea of impact largely in terms of student attainment and sometimes curriculum content fairly narrowly, and methodologically was dominated by mixed methods evaluations dependent on self-reporting surveys and questionnaires by teachers, and actually the findings of these were fairly vague. And then there's another body of research around artist teacher ideas that's kind of narrative case studies that focus more on teacher identity. But neither of these strands of research actually focused on the arts practices that teachers engaged with and what those practices did in the classroom. So I started with this hunch that what was needed was not just an engagement with art teachers, but also with the classroom or classrooms, and with the materials and processes of arts practice as kind of equal participants in the study. And that in order to do that, part of that should involve me taking up and exploring those materials and practices that I encountered myself as part of a research activity. So this vague sense of direction came together around the idea of asking a group of art teachers to make art in their own classrooms over a period of time, and to spend time with them in their classrooms as they did it. I mean, this would be unthinkable now, but fortunately I was able to do it then a couple of years ago, and for me to make work alongside them as a form of exploration. I didn't really know how any of that artwork would inform the research outcome, because I was also committed to writing as a means of disseminating to contexts where arts practice may be marginalised, which is often where the people that hold the purse strings for funding reside. So what I'm presenting here are 7 guiding principles for researching as an artist or artistically within an educational context that have emerged from the beginning stages of this research project, which eventually became a year-long study across 4 schools, in which I'm close to submitting in the form of a version of a PhD thesis. So I'm not reporting on results here, but rather on the approach that has informed the study as it's gone along. It sits at the boundaries between artistic and ethnographic inquiry, occupying a post-qualitative, non-representational space. My own background, I should say, is first as an artist, then as a secondary art teacher, and then in HE as leader of education and arts-related CPD and MA programmes. So the title is Towards an Ethical Framework for Post-Qualitative Research, and the larger study that it's about is looking at the notion of the artist teacher as someone engaging with school-aged children, supported by other arts teachers and arts professionals, deliberately pursuing arts practice, expecting that it will impact what happens in their classroom. And I'm really asking, what is it that this kind of way of framing the teacher, what does it introduce to the classroom, or what does it have the potential to introduce? Oh, it's not moving on. There we go, that should work. So my first principle then is the idea of asking what if to speculate. Manning suggests that traditional research methods have a tendency to function as safeguards against the ineffable. That which cannot be summed up in words, which is, of course, the arts. The arts are ineffable. The speculative experimentation of the arts and post-qualitative inquiry forgoes those safeguards. Wilkie calls the safeguards matters of anticipation, calculation, management, and the preemption of risk, which lead to business as usual. And arts inquiry resists this, resists what's probable by inquiring what is possible, into what is possible. It asks what if. There we go, which brings me to my second principle, finding a safe place to dive in, finding a way of getting inside the research event. I wanted to engage with a community of arts teachers pursuing their own arts practice in their teaching context, but knowing how to proceed was difficult. What if I get a whole department making their own art in their classroom was a good speculative question, but what would the time commitment be? How much contact would I have with the teachers? What methods would I use to record it? What would I be recording? What pupils would be involved? And my answer was always, well, that depends on what kind of art the teachers and myself end up making. But the ethics application required decisions before actively engaging participants in dialogue, and it was all about those safeguards, anticipation, calculation, management, preemption of risk. But I felt I needed to dabble and paddle a bit first before being able to answer those questions, to find out where there might be any rocks lurking under the surface and so on. So the solution was a pilot study structured around a workshop called Drawing in Space that formed the starting point of the Artist Teacher CPD I ran in the university I was based in at the time. The workshop was run by an artist who had previously facilitated it for me. And as in the university setting, she was paid. It had two parts. Part one, a day spent drawing three-dimensionally in the classroom in between lessons, and then living with the installation for a couple of days and perhaps adding to it. And then an evaluative reflective drawing session on the afternoon of the day 4 to think through and discuss what came out of the week for us. So on the first day, the classroom quickly fell silent as the two teachers involved tentatively began. Silence can be productive, but it began to feel awkward, and I could feel our unease at trying to work out how to behave. Attempting to break the tension, I began to play with some of the materials provided, and after a while decided that I might as well do my own drawing in space too. And we each worked in a corner. Space is not generally occupied by students, being too scared to kind of branch out into ways that might interrupt the classroom space more than that. The artist eventually asked us to pause in our creations, and we looked at what each other had created. The works so far felt tentative, no one being brave enough to extend out in ways that would interrupt normal use of the space. The teachers were aware of slowing down and losing track of time, and they felt disoriented as a result. We'd used string, wool, cotton, rope, tights, ribbon, a bicycle inner tube, and a coat hanger in our drawings. And the coat hanger in the picture on the right bent to form a hook by one of the teachers with a slightly pointed end hung ominously from the rubber tube suspended from the ceiling. It swayed almost imperceptibly and it felt menacing. And you see on the left the body language as the artist and one of the teachers is kind of taking a step back to look at it, like crossed legs, arms folded. It was all very defensive. What we'd not discussed in advance was the need to actively surrender to the research inquiry and to each other. In different ways we had to do this. My decision to take part was in the workshop was a surrender of critical distance, of being the outside observer. But the teachers, in surrendering their habitual occupation of the teaching space, made the braver move. And the notion of surrender became increasingly important to the larger inquiry as it progressed, related to the idea of thirdness. Third space being a space of surrender to the other, where we're able to face the other without objectifying and have to trust the same of them, whether they're human or non-human others. Benjamin suggests that the play and surrender of thirdness is fragile. Spaces of thirdness, she suggests, if we attempt to stay there too long, soon break down. And the insight from that was dual facing, related to the surrender required to take part in arts practice as a practitioner, but also to my own attempts to create a research space that I felt was ethical. And then to consequently using this principle to structure the rhythm of the growing study around moments of encounter that were time and space limited, so that participants were able to step outside of, rather than expecting them to be constantly interacting with the study. We had to schedule in these moments. So fortunately, in the workshop, the first workshop, we didn't stay in this tense defensive space. The workshop did find momentum and there was a sense of surrender. What happened next is hard to describe, as lots of things happened at once. There was a sudden feeling of energy in the room. Sarah suggested we move to work on someone else's drawing. 2 other members of staff, both technicians, came into the room to see what was happening, and one asked if they could join in. Julie accidentally knocked a jar of pens onto the floor under a table, and I stuck some masking tape on the floor near them. And then Catherine extended the line so that it headed across the room and went out the door. And as it went out into the corridor, she made the line with some orange cord stuck down at intervals with small bits of masking tape. And the line reached along the corridor almost as far as her own classroom. Eventually, she covered the string entirely with tape so that the faint orange thread could only just be seen below it. When colleagues and students entered the classroom space, they were apologetic, as if interrupting, carefully manoeuvring around rather than interacting with the installation. And the teachers were uncertain in their replies to queries about what was going on, as if they'd been caught in the act. However, this taped line on the floor out in the corridor had immediate effect. Students and teachers walked along it as if on a tightrope, with others and on their own. Some zigzagged from side to side, jumped across it as they moved along. Questions weren't asked about it, it wasn't skirted around, and the staff seemed under no compulsion to offer any explanation about it. In our afternoon evaluative session, we named this moment as being significant, as having something about it. But what? How was it nameable? We couldn't really answer it at that time. And this moment of energy and movement stayed with me for a long time before it began to speak to the research. McClure suggests that in post-qualitative materialist research, data does not become meaningful through processes of analysis and critique, but that data have their ways of making themselves intelligible to us, describing data as glowing in moments that involve a loss of mastery over language, causing one to wonder, to look more closely, to ponder, to be with for a little longer, carrying it around, waiting for the emergence of sense. So in accounting for the energy within the masking tape and orange string line, I return to Bennett's Vibrant Matter, in which she argues for a recognition of thing power, the curious ability of inanimate things to animate, to act, to produce effects, dramatic and subtle. And here she acknowledges the possibility that objects might engage with us. You don't have to wholly agree with Bennett's ontology, I think. She herself states that she's not sure if her ideas are true, but they're fuel for the imagination and speculation. And one focus for Bennett's research has been the relationship that excessive hoarders have with their objects, noting that hoarders say things like, the things called out to me, or that the things just took over. She suggests that normal perception, dealing with the overwhelming amounts of stuff around us that we could perceive, subtracts those things that are not useful for us to perceive. And she hypothesizes that hoarders are bad at subtraction, good at reception, unable to filter out the call of things that threaten to overwhelm them. But she also acknowledges that artists are good at both. So it felt as if the masking tape and orange string assemblage called out in the classroom, enabling a way of breaking through the defensiveness of the first half hour or so. And as what I've named critical objects, they continued to glow after the workshop ended. I had to follow and wait to see where they'd take me. Meenak, who is an actor and teacher of actors, uses the metaphor of perching in her research to describe times of stepping back, waiting to find the flow again or to take flight, to take the opportunity to sit with the work so far. She explains, I did not know what that something was, but my years of practice as a practitioner told me that something would emerge. So knowing that the output of the research that I would be doing would be a written thesis, there have been times when I've been uncertain about the worth of time spent playing with materials myself. Perhaps the most accessible and easy to justify pieces are these drawings and montages in this presentation that I've made from the research data. There's a lovely defense of drawing as analysis, or more specifically tracing, given by Maureen Michael. And I think I see the progress of my drawings not so much as analysis, but as providing a kind of distance, not objectivity so much, but a way of filtering the glow to find the residue, the kind of embers, if you like. But other later work is harder to explain in this way and falls more into the next guiding principle, that of responding or corresponding. I see other arts processes that I've engaged with, and here you'll see these. I've been making these assemblages of paint and plasticine and string and glue. These are things I think that help me carry the glow with me, but also to be carried along, to continue with speculation, to wonder where might this go, what might this become next. Non-representational speculative approaches to research are not descriptive or critical in the way that traditional qualitative studies have been. As a process of being with the materials themselves, the outcomes of such research are not of or about, but they're a response to. They don't describe or interpret as qualitative research tends to do, but they reciprocate, or to use Ingold's term, they correspond. correspondence, as Ingold describes, is the process by which beings or things answer to one another over time. He states that the responses we give in research we don't own, but we owe. And I kind of see these attempts of myself, like the risk of making my own tentative makings, a part of a debt owed to the teachers, the participants in my research, who've also taken the risk of making the things themselves. And here are some of their pieces. And you will have to wait for a further presentation to really unpick these and the findings of what the effect that these have in the classroom and what they kind of do in the classroom space. So just to recap, that the principles that have kind of informed this study with the teachers, with their classrooms, with their arts practices, have been that of speculation, asking what if, looking for safe spaces to dive in, acknowledging the fragility of being with each other and being with these practices in classroom spaces, and being willing to surrender to that fragility, following the data that glows, and attending to the human and non-human participants in the research study as having a life of their own, going with the flow and offering a response. Thank you. I hope that's within time, just about.
Thanks, Carol. Thanks for a wonderful and really interesting presentation. So we have a few minutes for some questions. You can, of course, submit a question using Slido, and then this is then something I can read out. So I've got one here from Rachel, who asks, what were the ethical considerations that you encountered when supporting researching artist teachers making their own art practice alongside their pupils?
There's loads. I think the first one is really, and I'm not sure, like in terms of making an ethics application, I think this is one that perhaps non-arts people perhaps would underestimate, but as an artist myself, I was really aware of, was just how vulnerable it is for arts teachers to put themselves on the line like that, to say, here is my own arts practice, and to open themselves up to the judgment of their peers, other teachers, but also their students and their colleagues, in ways that might risk undermining some of the I don't know, the quite orthodox practice of arts education in school. So one of the things that really came out of the study was the dominance of observational drawing, or drawing from a photograph, particularly in arts education, as a key skill that denotes expertise. And none of the arts teachers in their own arts practice did anything that came anywhere close to what might be called a drawing of that nature. And a lot of the work and practices that they were engaged with were more conceptual or more abstract. And so it kind of almost undermined the hierarchy of skill that was emphasized in the classroom. So there's two ethical considerations there, which is really where that looking for a safe space to dive in was important, and the kind of guarantee to the teachers and to the school itself that this wasn't about seeking to change the curriculum in their classrooms in any way. It wasn't about making the practice that the students were engaged with. We weren't looking for them to suddenly become incredibly experimental and throwing tradition out of the window and so on. It was really saying we're going to work around those gaps and look for those safe spaces where people don't feel that they're risking too much. I think that was probably the main thing. And then the other thing that I think any work you do with teachers, just in terms of workload, being aware of, the context that I was working with, there were heads of department that were going off on long-term sick with stress and things like that. These were normal schools that I was seeking to engage with. So again, that kind of sense of the kind of not expecting that space of surrender to be constant, but negotiating with the teachers. Where do we think how can we time this so that the encounters we have in this study are not going to add workload pressure, and workload was a huge thing that came out as a theme within the study as well, and the role of being the ideal artist teacher. Art isn't always benign. I think if we make the mistake if we think that art is always a good thing, there is an element of the artist teacher ideal that is about teachers' neoliberal ideas of productivity and enterprise, that it's not enough to be a teacher who's done an arts degree in the past. If we're expecting them to continually be proving their worth through being productive as artists, there's an element of that I think is unethical too. So those were the kind of main ethical issues that came out of it. Those were the rocks lurking, really, that the pilot study helped to bring to the fore, and our discussions after that really then informed the wider study that across. So this is just one school that I started with the pilot study, and then we opened it up to 4 schools with a structure that had grown out of that first pilot.
Thanks a lot. And well, we've got the questions coming in very thick and fast now, so maybe there's time for a few more. So Portia asks, how does the presentation of your assemblages differ from that of an artist? How does that work with non-artists, such as your team collaborators?
Well, that's something I'm still trying to work through myself. I think, and we discuss this a lot ourselves with the teachers. What makes something art? What makes somebody an artist? And I think it's to do with showing, and how you choose to show the work. And I think a kind of materialist, post-qualitative kind of way of approaching this, that things don't stay stable. Our identities, we're not stable as beings, but neither are objects. So an object can on one day be presented as a piece of art and be approached in that way. On another day, it can be approached as a piece of sociological inquiry. And I think it's the questions we ask of those things. So this is where Gert Beister's work has been really helpful to me. He talks about, we can either approach the art object and ask, what can I learn from this? In terms of facts and so on. And I think sociological inquiry does that a bit with objects. It's like, what can we learn from this? What is this illustrating, and so on. Whereas in arts inquiry, actually what we do when we encounter a work of art is, it's not so much what can I learn from this, but what is this teaching me? And I think those two different ways of approaching the same object. So my assemblages, I think, function a little bit like that, as do the works of art that the teachers make, more importantly. Either we can say, what can we learn from this about teachers, about schools, or we can say, what are these teaching me? What are these asking of me? Which demands a response. And so there are those, I think that's how I kind of see the objects working. They're not static things. They don't have one way of being. Their way of being changes over time.
Okay, so I wonder, do we have time for one more quick question? Oh, okay. Well, we've got lots of questions that have come in here, and we will have time at the end for some further discussion. So we will be able to return to some of these questions at the end. But thanks again to Carol, and thanks to everybody for your questions. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Laura Louise Nicklin with a presentation, From Beyond to Behind Bars, exploring an ethnographic approach to arts-based educational research to explore the use of Shakespeare in the prison education context. Laura, thanks.
Thank you, Adam. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I'm just going to open sorry, everything's just closed on me. Can you all? Now I've got it. Brilliant. Okay, excellent. Sorry, for a minute there I had a freeze. Okay, so yeah, hi everyone, I'm Laura Nicklin. I'm now a research fellow in the Faculty of Education, Health and Wellbeing in cyber psychology at the University of Wolverhampton, which isn't somewhere I thought I'd be. I actually graduated in lockdown from my PhD this year. It's an education PhD. It's heavily grounded in the arts and in performance. So that's the research that informs what I'm going to talk to you about today. Now, I absolutely encourage tweeting if people want to do so. So I hope you know the hashtag. It's hashtag Vera_artsed, and I'm at Lali Louise 1. As you know, these presentations were designed for the originally planned Vera conference. So this is about a project, the research project's finished, but the intervention I'm talking about is absolutely on hold at the moment. In fact, just about every prison is inaccessible right now. But I think that's a really important thing for us to consider, and something to maybe think about in the discussion in questions in terms of the existing access and barriers caused by COVID-19 and how kind of that's exacerbated barriers that were already there. I am very aware that I'm talking about prisons. This is a very methodological paper. I'm not going to go into my findings very much. I'm not going to give any specifics about the participants that I worked with. But if you do feel uncomfortable or triggered by anything, please feel free to mute me, come back in 10-15 minutes and we'll go from there. Okay, so throughout the last 2 decades, there's been a progressive emergence of Shakespeare-focused performance-based programmes intended for to work alongside traditional criminal rehabilitation, so to work alongside a prison sentence, or even in some juvenile cases as an alternative sentence. But it's the adult work I'm going to touch on today that I've done. Several courts have allowed this, several prisons, several states, and as somebody who really loves Shakespeare, I know how that might sound. It may sound like something exciting, and you might really love Shakespeare, but you might say, actually, that's not really my idea of a punishment. For others, your experiences of Shakespeare at school might be much more like a punishment and resemble some kind of torture. So either way, bear with me, whichever side of the line you are. Okay, so excellent. Before engaging further with my own work, it must be acknowledged that throughout history, the value of prison-based criminal retribution has been called into question. We have a punitive system that places heavy emphasis on incarceration to punish offenders. It's really important for me to tell you that this is not going to be a talk about prison abolition. I'm not here to kind of go through the rights and wrongs of prison, but have you ever wondered why with so many prisons, we still have so much crime? The answer might surprise you, but prison doesn't work, at least if the intention is to stop criminal offending and reoffending and recidivism. And actually what seems to work better is community sentences, educational interventions, and possibly Shakespeare. I know how that might sound as well. Some of these statistics look very out of date. This is based on my PhD research, so I'm using the statistics from the time purely because that's what underpinned, and that's what I knew, that's what I was able to access going into this research project. And some of them are quite stark, right? So 3/4 of prisoners released in the USA in 2010 were rearrested by 2015. That's a lot. And for young people, 68% of UK children that are reoffending within a year. These are some quite stark figures. So there really is something wrong in the existing system. Now, this was articulated, I think, best by one of my participants. I'd love to show you. This was an ethnographically informed study. A lot of my participants wrote stories and drew pictures. I'd love to show you some of these things, but with it being live on YouTube, I can't show you a lot of it. But this one was pretty anonymous on a typewriter. So he says, the fact of the matter is, locking people up and locking people down punishes them, yes, but it clearly doesn't correct them, and the system that thinks otherwise is wrong. Now, I think it's really important that this comes from the voice of one of my participants. All of the data in my research, all of the findings, all of the stories are co-constructed narratives. I give the authority, I share the authority that comes with the privilege of being a researcher with my participants to speak for themselves and give a voice to those communities, not to put my own voice in like just an external observer saying what I think is happening. It's really important to me that it was informed by that. Okay, so don't do this yet. Freeze, let me just explain it to you. I think it's really important that we understand when we're thinking about prison education and criminal justice education, the structural issues and injustices around justice, around criminal justice. And one of them is stereotype in society and the way that society facilitates, the media facilitate, popular culture facilitates really stereotypical and blanket perceptions of prisoners. So this isn't a reflection on you. I've done this with school children and they've sworn at me with permission somewhat, but some of the responses I got were interesting to say the least. But this is going to build a word cloud. Put yourselves in the mind of the tabloid media, the kind of stereotypical language in society to describe someone labelled a prisoner. What words, names, descriptors, what kind of language do we see in those situations? Go for it. Yeah, so there's a couple coming up I can see now. So low life, yeah, absolutely. That's one I've heard a lot. Felon, yeah, absolutely. Waste of space, yeah, that's a really important one actually. And quite often at the point of accusation, even before a criminal sentence is passed, there's this assumption that you know, somebody is automatically one of these derogatory terms. Yeah. I'm going to let those keep coming in, and I'm going to keep talking to you because I think it's actually quite important for us to assess and to think about those ideas. And I think the more you do this kind of task, the more stark these images are. But the point is that in kind of stereotypical or tabloid-esque considerations, offenders, prisoners, anybody who's kind of pointed out as committing a crime or doing something seen as against society are frequently noted to be blanket thugs, punks, scum, any of these words you see on the screen, and other derogations under this collective blanket. Now, most significantly, I'm going to jump on now. Thank you, everybody, for your input. Most significantly, yeah. So that's some of the kind of words you see. They're very rarely talked about as a man, a child, a woman, a human being. And yeah, of course, I can see why that comes across, but it's really important to think about how society sees prisoners and how they're seen. Now, rightly or wrongly, the criminal justice system that we have says you do a crime, you serve your sentence, and you're supposed to get on with and live a normal life. That's the system we have. That's not my fault, that's just how it works. However, in society, what we actually see is when a prisoner is released or an ex-prisoner is released, there are limited housing opportunities, limited work opportunities, limited opportunities for a prisoner to re-enter or even enter society for the first time, depending on some of the kind of structural characteristics and issues that have facilitated their journey to that point. I'm going to talk about this in a little while, but a lot of ethnographic research is supposed to be in a community very different from one's own. And for me, I thought that was going to be the case. I'm not ashamed of my background. I come from a working class background. I had a very disruptive growing up. I moved house a lot. I had a lot of challenges, shall we say. And a lot of the stories the prisoners actually shared with me were very similar to my own journey, right up until the point that their trajectory went towards crime and my trajectory, fortunately, went towards education. Now, in society, this might sound flippant, but we are taught from a very early age this kind of binary good guys, bad guys narrative. And what we end up seeing is nobody ever asks what happens when Scooby-Doo's latest costume ghost is taken away or Batman's latest capture is shipped off to Gotham Police Station. But all the way through these series, we then see the same archetypes, the same characters popping back up and striking again. Now, it sounds funny, it sounds like those youthful stories that we've all enjoyed and engaged with. But actually, when you think about society, you can kind of see how those constructions appear. Now, not only does society treat and see prisoners in that way, but prisoners also know that's how they're seen. They're able to articulate that they believe and they feel and they are treated as less than or separate from wider society, dehumanized by the society around them. Now, with that in mind, when the razor wire comes down and long after the prisoner is released, there's a real responsibility on both sides for society and for the individual to make that change happen. Otherwise, neither side is ever going to care about the other. And that's what the Shakespeare programme aims to do. I'm not going to go into findings too much because I'm really conscious of time, but basically I wanted to know about this, and I didn't want to know about it like a CCTV camera or the Ofsted inspector that goes in and sees the school on their 3 best behaved days of the year. I wanted to be an active participant researcher in this work. Now, I'm an English woman that went and did an ethnography in a men's US prison. I very clearly cannot just situate myself in that community entirely organically, and it would have been deceptive to do so. But by being able to actually spend 3 months engaging with these programs, engaging with the program groups across a couple of states, I was able to really participate in what they were doing. If they were running and throwing around the room, I was running and throwing around the room. If they were writing stories, sharing, performing, I was doing just the same thing. And ideally on the same level, really working to build that trust and gather that connection. And through something so creative. So I wanted to know what was going on, what were the practices, what were the intended and perceived outcomes from the participant perspectives. As a teacher myself, I know I can have an objective for a session or something I want people to learn, but what they've learned quite often surprises me and comes from my students. So what are the kind of perceived outcomes of that? And what does Shakespeare bring to the party? Because even with someone with a master's in Shakespeare, I couldn't quite believe that Shakespeare was this kind of magical fix for all criminal justice. Interestingly, it isn't the programmes that perpetuate that idea. That's not what they claim either. It's what media representations and kind of ideas without that underpinning of research suggest about the programmes. It's just not true. So these are just some definitions if you're not familiar with ethnography, if you're not used to it. And again, that idea of kind of co-constructing, being in a community, building that kind of overlap of kind of first-hand empirical investigation and actually that interpretation and that built narrative as a kind of together project, as a together voice. My research facilitates that voice emerging. I really love this picture. I got it off Twitter and I've lost the picture credit for it, but I'd love to track it down, and hopefully I will. It's about building a portrait. So I could have done the kind of research there and the knowledge. So there's the knowledge, there's all the data I could have found. I could have done some interviews, could have done some surveys, could have asked some questions. But actually what was really interesting and really useful was the mixture that I managed to get. I did do some interviews, I did ask some questions, I did do some observations, but more than that, the organic conversations, the engagement with the creative performances, the ability actually for me to share my research questions and what I was interested in with the prisoners I was working with. They were all male prisoners across levels 1 to 4 criminality, so up to a pretty high level of criminality. Some of them were lifers, they were never getting out. And actually being able to engage in those communities and see the value that they felt in still doing something creative, something arts-based within their prison sentence, and actually using those types of data. So comparing that knowledge, building on that experience, and then putting them together in a way that I could not see from those dots. I couldn't have seen that myself from that data. I needed those participant voices to show me and trace that route for me through the data to help the best ethnographic portrait, the best lens, the best creative story to really demonstrate what these programs are capable of, with the kind of bricklayer idea of building and constructing a portrait. These were just some of the types of data that I built in. As I say, kind of being able to give people the space from the off-the-cuff comments through to, they wrote on the back of torn off pieces of paper, candy wrappers, anything they could find, and they'd give me a response kind of 2 weeks after we'd discussed something, or a period of time when they'd really had time to engage with it and think about it, writing poems, drawing pictures, all sorts of different types of data that you wouldn't necessarily traditionally see, particularly for a PhD. I kind of took on a bit of a monster, and I got more data than I could have ever imagined, but the accessibility and the equality that, well, equity and equality that this kind of data, this kind of research brought in exploring something creative through something creative was really phenomenal. I think the best thing for me in thinking about kind of benefits of creative research was doing an ethnographic study and kind of shifting these preconceived notions and misunderstandings into positive comprehensions. I say it there, and what I mean by this is, even for me as a researcher going in and having my own kind of understanding and my own ideas about what it would be like, I walked across a terrifying prison yard with guard towers and razor wire and guns, things that I'm not used to seeing every day of the week. And I walked into the classroom. Now, when you enter the room, everybody sits down. First person comes in and sits down. Second person shakes hands with the first. 30th person shakes hands with the other 29, fist bumps them, greets them, welcomes them into the space. And it creates a space that's transcendent of the prison environment. I walked into a room petrified, and within 5-10 minutes, I realised I could actually be in any classroom, anywhere, with a group of students who had probably actually done the reading and done a little bit more work than my students ever do. actually being able to get that unique insight and getting a feel for that space, building that trust. And they told me at times they didn't trust me when I went in. They didn't understand if I was a do-gooder. They didn't understand why somebody's parents would let them go and hang out in a men's prison. Apparently, you know, that's something they would never let their children do. But it was really interesting to kind of get that insight into that culture and draw on all those perspectives. Even someone with a label like robber, like gangster, like murderer, there's an assumption that they're all the same, and it's just not true. There are so many more nuances and identities and issues underneath these behaviours, underneath these to unpick. And this is what the programmes do through Shakespeare. I don't have time to tell you about my findings, I'm really sorry, but here are the highlights. The Shakespeare specific stuff was great. There's a big range of characters, there's a big range of stories, of plays, of issues and emotions across Shakespeare that there is enough there for almost every individual to see themselves or find themselves in, holding Shakespeare's mirror up to nature to themselves. But the more powerful thing, arguably, was the programme practices, the way that they completely shifted and were completely opposite to the traditional prison environment. Now, it's really important to note there's no rewards for participating in this programme. One of them has this joke that you don't even get donuts in Shakespeare, like they would at some of the other groups that they get. The only incentive is participation. So if they cheat their way through it, nobody's lost, but there's real potential for gain. But developing the skills they did through the practices, empathy, communication, learning, literacy, recognition and working through their issues in a creative way led to this overall rehumanization, or for some of them their first ever humanization, seeing themselves and being seen by the wider community through cultural capital, through performance, through communication and skills as part of, not separate to, humanity. I'm going to finish here, but it's been a very brief whistle-stop tour, and I just want to leave you with one idea that, I mean, I wouldn't be convinced by a 15-minute presentation either, but this is a sensitive topic and people are often uncomfortable with prisoners accessing this kind of activity. So if you're really skeptical and you kind of think, well, whatever it achieves, I'm not all right with this, you may not know this information. Over 90% of prisoners will be released eventually in the United Kingdom. Who do you want to be your next door neighbour, or your cousins, your mums, your grands, your best friends? Somebody who's been trapped in a prison with only their existing mindset and thoughts and existing, surrounded by people with those same kind of existing ideas to facilitate that for company, or somebody who you know has at least had the opportunity, the education and just the creativity to be able to unpick that, to think twice, think again, and you never know, they might even catch a matinee with you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Laura, for that really interesting presentation. And I'm sure we'd all be very interested to hear more about your findings. It's unfortunate we don't really have time to go into that in any detail. I think we've got time for one quick question. So Becky asked, were there any accessibility issues in using Shakespeare in particular, thinking from a perspective of education levels, learning difficulties, and English as a second language?
Yeah, that's it's a really good question actually, and it's a question I get a lot because of the assumptions and because of the kind of well-known lack of undiagnosed learning difficulties within a prison space. But actually what I found was the prisoners were sharing that yes, it had enhanced their literacy and accessing Shakespeare, but also the programmes didn't put any emphasis on the right meaning. They didn't have to read Shakespeare and interpret it in the way that you kind of see somebody dramaturgical would really dig into it and do that for a performance and get that background. What they actually did was kind of say, okay, what do you think it means? Well, what does it talk about to you? Okay, and what's that got to do with you? So they could give a really unusual, a really different reading of a character. And somebody talked about a watchman from Much Ado About Nothing, and how that had kind of made him reflect on gang life, gang behaviour, and kind of how feeling more important than you are and being treated in a certain way, but actually not being that important and being used. This whole kind of reflection on a character that it's not in the text, it's, you know, not there, or if it is there, it's not been seen before. But I think that was really important, and also the accessibility, so being allowed to access it however you wanted to. You could write whole pieces, you could read whole texts, or you could talk, you could listen, you could share, you could do the practical activities. There's a lot of choice within that framework. As long as you're engaged and you're participating, there's that space and that accessibility enabled for everybody, which is not something you'd think of being in a prison.
Well, thanks a lot. Thanks, Laura, for a really interesting presentation. There are, as I'm sure there will be with all these presentations, more questions than we can answer, but we will have time for some further discussion at the end. So if your question isn't answered, then I hope you will ask it again at the end, or if you have another question. So I'd now like to introduce Lindsay. Do we have the first slide, please?
No, I'm just going to say hello, really, and then we're going to
okay.
Yeah. I must say, so I'm Lindsay Ibbotson. I'm working up in the Northeast with music, sort of trying to infuse music into early years and Key Stage 1 practice across the piece, really. And it's absolutely fascinating listening to what you're talking about, following the data that glows. I'm absolutely loving this. And what I have done, which you will see in this presentation, is to go with a sort of medical research background and look at quantitative data and to be very, very thorough about gathering in numbers. But then I have found in the course of the research that we've been doing up here, some of the things that you've been describing and effects on behavior and identity and co-making the work. So yes, if I can now ask for the button to be pressed on the video, I will hopefully answer any questions afterwards.
First Thing Music started as a research project introducing Kodály-based music to early years and Key Stage 1 children in the northeast of England. The name reflects two ideas. That music should happen first thing every morning, and perhaps it should be the first thing that teachers need to underpin their professional practice. Music is valuable in its own right, but is there more to it? Anecdotally, there seems to be a link between mathematical ability and musical ability and language, but perhaps it's the early benefits that happen in social interaction and behaviour that create the foundation for a disposition for learning. There is little evidence out there. 2 studies have shown a positive impact on outcomes, the greatest effect being for children from disadvantaged backgrounds, particularly boys. So, in 2017, we conducted a small, unfunded, randomised control feasibility study in a primary school in Stockton-on-Tees with Dr. Benghwat C, Senior Research Fellow at the Durham School of Education and the co-author of the Arts in Education Review in 2016. 56 children from 2 reception classes were randomised into 2 groups, with one of the class teachers and the intervention group having 15 minutes of Kodály-based musical activity every morning for 4 days per week. I've been using a Kodály-based approach for many years. It has a clear, progressive structure, lots of interaction, and it's focused mainly on voice, so there's no need to raid the instruments cupboard. We measured progress using the 17 early learning goals from the early years foundation stage. The teachers were routinely assessing progress on this basis each term, so there was no need for additional disruption for their work pattern. After the first term, we used the Hedges G test to look at the formative midway assessment of the early learning goals. There were significant gains in the prime areas of learning, self-confidence and behaviour, but we found little statistical difference in number or literacy skills. However, the class teachers felt that they were seeing a positive effect, and there were parents saying, can their children have the full music lesson? So we decided to merge the 2 classes and to carry on. We noticed that the experienced children were helping the new children to catch the songs. And the teachers observed that the classroom games made their way out into the playground. Was the playful nature of this approach contributing something here? At the final assessment, we found that the intervention group had continued to pull ahead of the controls in behaviour and had also started to show a small to medium effect in writing. So we wondered if the music intervention was supporting the prime areas of learning in the early stages, which was expressed later in the specific areas of learning. On the strength of this pilot, the opportunity arose to scale things up, and the First Thing Music project ran in schools in the northeast of England and Sheffield from September 2018. The First Thing Music delivery team was a collaborative partnership between the British Kadai Academy and Tees Valley Music Service, joint funded by the Education Endowment Foundation and the Royal Society for the Arts as part of their Learning About Culture initiative. And it was evaluated by the Behavioural Insights team at University College London. We randomised 110 classes into either intervention or control groups, but that also gave us a cohort of 55 non-specialist primary school teachers to support. The intervention was to introduce 15 minutes of singing activity at the start of each school day. Primary outcome measures focused on literacy, using the proficiency in reading assessment, and in behaviour, using the social skills improvement system. Unfortunately, results of the impact evaluation have been delayed by slow access to the GDPR and also then COVID, but we are expecting publication to happen in March 21. But today, we are able to focus on the results of the process evaluation. The task for us was to introduce non-specialist primary school teachers to a foundation in Kadai-based music, beginning with a sense of beat, then rhythm, and then pitch. Using experiential learning to build from the subconscious to the conscious, using the pedagogical approach, preparation, presentation, and practice. On day one, all the teachers in the intervention group completed a survey. We measured 12 items across 4 domains, measured using the 5-point Likert scales. Then the training began. We had a team of 6 specialist practitioners, each of whom supported and mentored up to 10 of the teachers. There was one introductory training day, led by Lucinda Gagan of the BKA, with support from early years specialist Zoe Greenhalgh, followed by 6 half-termly afternoon sessions. But much of the real work was to go on in the classrooms. Each teacher had their specialist mentor visit them on a weekly basis, but at the beginning, those mentors came in every day. At first, they let the teacher sit in on the sessions as part of the class. But increasingly, the teachers took over the leading, and the mentor role became one of support as required. The children were encouraged to engage creatively with the activities, often using the same song in many different ways over the weeks. The learning was more about the play and the skills than the amount of repertoire. This front-loaded approach to the CPD, especially in the early weeks, was a very important factor for building the confidence in the teachers. Over the course of the year, the intervention teachers were also learning about what is known so far about why music is so important to child development and how to build it into their everyday practice. In order to bring together the practical elements of this embodied learning process, together with the theoretical framework, we filmed all of the CPD throughout the year. During planning, the Ethics Committee had stressed the importance of access to the training resources for all control participants at the end of the study, and this became the First Thing Music website, with videos, sound files and PDF versions of song cards and supporting text. The practical elements were often what carried the deepest learning potential, and it was often obvious that the teachers were having as much fun as the children. Here are 2 teachers getting to grips with physical and musical coordination over the rhythm patterns in a rhyme. Queen, Caroline, time to make it shine. Queen, Caroline. Yeah. At the end of the project, we repeated the original survey. There was a considerable shift in self-perception of competence, and bear in mind, these are not musical specialist teachers. We also collected data from the specialist mentors, who observed the developing confidence of the teachers over time. This is a sample from the early weeks. On the final day of the project, we split into focus groups led by independent evaluators with the teachers and school leaders. We entered their comments under the following headings. We had barriers, which were often down to timetabling support, facilitators, including regularity of the CPD sessions and the mentor visits and the social aspects, and impacts, improved teacher confidence, children following instructions more quickly with less nagging, and easier school drop-offs with children eager to join the music in the mornings. We also collected reflective journals from those teachers who were prepared to write these to convert their practical experience into a fully accredited CPD qualification. Here are 2 quotes. We await the publication of the results by the EEF and RSA in March 21. The fact that the GDPR regulations have hampered access to the data just indicates the difficulties experienced by educational researchers. I wonder whether the same difficulties would be experienced by medical science practitioners at the moment. But the qualitative data we gathered and the quantitative pre- and post-survey showed that we had made progress in our aim to establish a common foundation for music practice within the teaching workforce. This is so important when teacher retention is an issue. Working in the classroom with the teachers, reflecting on their experiences, we have essentially developed a close-to-practice model within a randomised controlled trial. Though the impact evaluation has been delayed, many of the schools could see for themselves that something important was going on in the classroom and have decided not to wait for publication. Tees Valley Music Service has continued with Kodály training both for staff and for schools. But in a rapidly changing world, we now need to think virtually. So this year we are running First Thing Music online, collaborating with schools and music hubs, including Tees Valley and the Bedfordshire Inspiring Music Programme, to provide CPD and initial teacher training. This 2.5-term blended learning programme draws on the 100 plus videos and other resources already developed, with a hub and spoke model linking to our expert tutors and their students. It blends weekly video broadcasts for asynchronous learning with live synchronous tutorials in Zoom groups of up to 6 students. Watch this space.
Sounds good to me! How are you today?
Thank you for that fantastic presentation. I'll start my video. It's really great to see this issue of confidence in teaching music particularly among non-specialist teachers is such a well-documented issue, and so it's great to see this, like the evidence that you've gathered of the impact that this approach can have upon that. You did mention this towards the end, how this might be implemented into wider teacher training, but I was wondering if perhaps you could expand upon that.
Well, yes, it's all very embryonic at the moment, but we're working with the BKA, again, British Kodály Academy, and Tees Valley Music Service, because they are really on a roll with this, and they've got themselves training this basic Kodály stuff with their entire staff. So that the idea is to try and link the hub musician expertise with what there is out there in the schools and support what is at a very, very basic level. Just the building bricks, just an understanding of beat and rhythm would do for me. But without that basic understanding across really all primary school teachers, it's very difficult to enjoy the other possibilities that lie in music and that sort of creative and interactive kind of way of living and educating. So we've got hubs hopefully coming in to get involved, and what's happening with the Bedfordshire hub is that they're working with me on developing a way of getting this across in this year when we're all sort of in the bunkers of COVID and we can't get out and can't go to schools very much, we're trying to develop this as an online kind of practice where a practitioner like the ones I was talking about in the video would zoom in perhaps to a classroom and work with a teacher and get them going as leading a session, and then just have weekly experiential conferences, little tutorials about how they're getting on. But the thing is, we're not trying to make every teacher into a music teacher. There's a reason, you know, why there are music specialists. We're really not trying to do that. But from what we can see with the effect on children of having the very, very basics, just to be able to synchronize on a count of 4, you know, and get on the beat and feel part of something with the rest of the group. That effect does help to create a sense of well-being, of being part of a group, of being synchronized, and it starts to develop. Well, the question is, does it develop a stronger foundation for a disposition for learning? So we are looking at initial teacher training, building in some of this kind of approach. I'm not a Kodály zealot, by the way. It's just that the Kodály approach breaks things down to such basic building bricks that, you know, anybody who can tap their foot can, you know, along to a track on the radio, can do this. If they've got a voice and they can tap the foot, they've got what they need to get started. And the impact on children's development outcomes, what we saw in our study was, you know, it was basically the prime areas of learning at first, but it went into specific areas later, given time to percolate. So you know, yeah, we're hoping that initial teacher training will incorporate this in time. It's too important to miss out. And yes, the frustration is, you know, that we haven't got the data through from the EEF and the RSA yet, for very good reasons. And so the Office for National Statistics wasn't able to give them access because of GDPR as quickly and easily as they wanted, and then they couldn't get into the office because COVID hit. So yeah, although the results were due last May, we're hoping that they'll be able to get something out by March of next year. And in the meantime, we continue to work. So Bedfordshire is experimenting with a small cohort of 2 schools, 5 reception teachers, and we're doing a sort of replication study using the online way of doing it.
Thanks a lot, Lindsay, for a really exciting presentation. And now we move on to our penultimate presentation, which is by Sophie Ward. So,
okay, am I ready to go?
Yeah, so we have Sophie Ward presented a project co-authored by Simon James, Kate James, Chris Brown, Dimitra Kukatsaki, I might have mispronounced that, and Jade Wigham, the Into Music project. So over to you, Sophie. Thanks.
Hi, thanks, Adam. Yeah, so this project that I'm reporting on today is Durham University's evaluation of this project. But no, Adam, it doesn't want to move forward. Adam, how do I make these slides go forward?
Okay.
It's frozen up there. Sorry about that. Yeah, so the project was devised by Kate James. Kate is the Into project manager, and she's based in Darlington Hippodrome. Darlington's the town in the northeast of England. And Kate devises a whole range of arts projects for use in schools in Darlington. Can I have the next slide, please? Kate decided for this project to work with Backchat Brass. Kate's worked with them previously. They're a professional brass ensemble based in Leeds. And Kate has 2 reasons for working with them. Firstly, they are professional musicians at a very high level, and they're excellent role models for the children in Darlington because they model for them the possibility of having an exciting, dynamic career. They perform at public festivals in the northeast and elsewhere in the country. And the second reason is they've developed over the years a really interesting pedagogy for teaching brass music to children. Please could I have the next slide. The project sits within a much larger project funded by Darlington Borough Council with money as well from UKRI, from Durham University. It's a 3-year-long project, and the aim is to support the school transition for Year 6 primary children in the poorest areas of Darlington as they progress into Year 7 and 8 of secondary school. And the reason being is that the poorest children in Darlington have been observed to be at the greatest risk of school refusal and dropout. So even if they're quite engaged in primary school, that this engagement often drifts away in secondary school. So Darlington Borough Council, I wanted to work with Kate to find out a way to make school feel better for children who are most deprived, and a more supportive environment for them so that they'll keep going to school and ultimately get their GCSEs. The project also, as I said before, had an aim to help these very deprived children work with professional musicians, and also, quite importantly as well, to have a lot of fun. Next slide, please. Warwick Music and UKRI provided some funding to purchase these plastic instruments, so they're pea trombones and pea cornets used in this project. They've been left in the schools, so they're a legacy of the project for schools to continue to use for the children. They sound really good. They are obviously much cheaper than brass instruments, but they're also lighter, so they're easier for teachers to move between classrooms. And they have little plastic mouthpieces that can be removed and sterilised, so quickly used by many different children. And I thought they sounded great. Next slide, please. The focus for evaluation, so we met together, Durham University, my colleagues, we met together with Kate, and we decided that we'd be focusing on our evaluation on two things. Firstly, pupil well-being, so that sense of being happy in yourself, and also social capital, which in this project we defined as the benefits that the individual and their community derive from positive interpersonal relationships, the kind of relationships that enable every individual to thrive. So feeling good in your class, at school, feeling good in your whole school, feeling good in your community. Next slide, please. So Durham University, in conjunction with Kate, we came up with this research question for our evaluation. So we weren't really interested in the non-quantifiable, so we were interested in the non-quantifiable, sorry, rather than looking to see if the Intermusic project had helped the children academically. We were looking to see if it could develop these things like excitement, engagement, things that the literature indicate are aligned with well-being and social capital. Next slide, please. This is how the project looked. We went into four primary schools in Darlington and one secondary school. And as you can see, for the most part, the project ran for 7 weeks, with the exception of one school. The idea of running it over 7 weeks was to really help develop this social capital, because again, the literature indicates that it takes time to build relationships of trust and mutual respect. And in the literature on music education in particular, the word fellowship appears a lot. And this idea of fellowship is I'm looked after and nurtured by you, you look after and nurture me, and that takes time to develop. So it ran for 7 weeks. Back Chat Brass went into the schools and they ran workshops with the children, and then they built towards a performance, and they invited the children's parents and the rest of the school to come and do these performances. I should point out that COVID-19 sort of disrupted things. So the children would have gone on to spend the summer performing with Back Chat Brass at one or more festivals. So Durham has a lovely brass festival every year. Sadly, that was cancelled due to COVID-19. But I should say that Kate has kept in contact with these children and delivered arts packs and things to their houses to keep that contact, to keep that development of social capital going. Next slide, please. For our evaluation, we employed something called the dialogic model of impact. So what we were really wanting to find out is how the children's behaviour had changed, and we understood this is not something we could have gone in and observed. We did do observations as well as interviews with the musicians, teachers and the children's parents, but we really understood from the outset that we really needed to work closely with the teachers to find out what they'd observed as people who spent an awful long time with these children and know them very intimately, so that they would be able to really give us that insight into how much the children have benefited from the project. Next slide, please. Our findings indicate that, in response to our research question, that yes, the Intermusic project did help children develop their well-being, and it did help develop social capital. The teachers told us that the children who were taking part in the project were extremely deprived. So one teacher says here, our children have quite tough lives. They have a hard life. It was quite an emotional project to be part of. As part of the observations, I went in, and when you see here the teachers all telling us that they really hope that this project would develop the self-confidence and self-esteem of the children. We might imagine that is something like, we want the children to be confident about getting on a stage and performing, but actually it was deeper than that. It was the self-confidence to speak in front of other children, and it was the self-esteem that meant that you weren't just collapsing in tears. I observed the project, and I noted the number of children who seemed very emotionally fragile. They would begin to cry. They would suddenly announce they were exhausted and need to sit down. And it was lovely to see the other children coaxing them to rejoin the group and to get, pick the instrument back up. And Back Chat Brass were just amazing with the children, really kind, really sensitive. And in the interviews, they said that they really understand the challenges faced by the children that they work with, and they take nothing for granted in those interactions. The teachers told us that the children really enjoyed the project, and one teacher used the word buzzing to describe the children afterwards, and another said they were braver. And this really meant a lot to the teachers, because these children who are experiencing severe and multiple disadvantage, some of them were looked after children, they were children dependent on food banks, children with very unhappy and challenging lives, and to begin to be buzzing and seem braver mattered a great deal to the teachers. Another thing that we were told by the teachers is how pleased they were that the parents had become engaged with the project. So there's a nice quotation from the teacher asking us, did we see the parents in the back? And of course we did. We did notice how proud the parents were. And the ones who talked about it being a big cycle, and this is very much in keeping with the literature on social capital, that when you form a community, a sense of fellowship, it ripples outwards. So it started with the group in the music workshops, it rippled out to the class, it rippled out to the whole school, and then wider into the whole community. And then teachers also told us how transformative the project had been over the course of 7 weeks for some of the children who, prior to taking part, were virtually mute in class. They wouldn't speak, they wouldn't participate, or that they behaved erratically or badly, they acted out. So teachers told us that children were braver, they were answering questions they'd never previously dared to reply to a teacher's question in class, having a go, taking risks, and also that they seemed to be more settled in their behaviour, a little bit calmer and a little bit more able to manage their emotions within the classroom setting. Next slide, please. We interviewed the parents, and it was, again, it was very moving speaking to the parents. They told us how much the children loved the project. The children were singing the songs at home, because as well as performing the brass, playing the brass instruments, the children were also singing. One boy was playing air trumpets and trombones. Other parents told us their children were talking about Back Chat Brass non-stop. And again, bearing in mind that these children have been selected by their teachers because they were identified as being children at risk from educational disengagement, who would be most likely to not transition well into secondary school, not engage and not continue with their education. When we interviewed the Back Chat Brass musicians, as you would expect for professional musicians, they said that they hoped that some of the children might be inspired to become brass musicians. It was very gratifying when a primary head teacher told us that one of the looked after children, described by the head teacher as a shy, retiring young lady, asked if she could learn to play the trombone and to take part in the project. And her foster parents are planning to support her with her music tuition. So that was obviously very gratifying for Back Chat Brass, that at least one child now sees themselves as a musician. Next slide, please. The project gathered a lot of support locally. It made it into the local media, and in fact, it was identified by Persimmon Homes Building Future as worthy of funding. And how it was run was it was advertised locally, and parents and friends and family could vote if they wanted to for Into Music. Now, a really great example of social capital. So many people voted for Into Music, and they were duly awarded £5,000 by Persimmon Homes Building Futures in order to run more Into Music projects. And in fact, Kate has told me recently she's been given funding now to run the project with 2 more Year 6 children for an entire class, rather than taking just some children out for this intervention, enabling the whole class, and more money to enable the whole class to benefit from this. So a lot of local support. And now I'd like to, would you be able to help me do this, Adam? I have a video to play of a project produced by Andy Berriman. So we go to the next slide, and I think it's a link. Adam, would you be able to make the video play?
It's so this is being controlled by Dior. Can we play the video? There we go.
Thank you.
We are Batchat Brass. We are an 8-piece brass band, trumpets, trombones, saxophone, sousaphone, drums, and we are in schools working with kids, teaching them plastic brass instruments.
Over 3 sessions we've learned how to play a specific instrument, and we've been learning a few songs with them, like Shotgun by George Ezra.
It's the first session where the main idea is to just get them making a sound on the instruments, learn about the instruments, learn about brass in general. Some of them might have an idea what trumpets and trombones are. And then over the weeks we look at some different musical skills using the instruments. So we look at how to change notes, how to play a particular rhythm, and then we kind of put those ideas into some of the tunes that we play as a band. And then the band have come for the last day to do a performance with the kids, and we're going to do that in front of parents and the rest of the school. So should we go?
Who can remember what happens in this tune? We do some singing at the start.
The first week it's always a bit of a laugh, a bit of fun, you know, the novelty of these instruments, but you start to see changes in some of the children who may start off finding it as a bit of a joke, but then they start to realise, oh, we're actually getting a nice sound here, we're starting to play as a band, we're starting to actually be involved in something together.
It's been really fun because we've never really learned about anything like that before, and I think it's one of the things that in primary school you hardly ever get to do, and it's just a really good experience. It's a thing to enjoy because you're not always in a classroom environment, and you don't have to be in a classroom to learn to do stuff because you learn different things every day, but this is like a totally different thing.
It's not just like you just sat there writing something down. You're actually there doing it, not just taking notes from it.
Yeah, it's not as rigid as a classroom. It's not one answer. You've got a broader range of what you can do.
While you see kind of music being dropped from curriculum and things like that, so there are less and less, fewer and fewer opportunities for children to get involved in music. To be able to bring it into the school, bring the instruments and kind of just put them in their hands and give them that opportunity. They may not want to take it up later down the line, but they may want to, and then it gives them the opportunity to try, which I think is slowly being cut back in general. So projects like this are very important to kind of get that, bring it to them rather than expect them to find it.
It's just the fact that giving kids the opportunity to try these things, and then if they like them, go ahead and do them. And because now we've got the instruments for the school, everybody should get an opportunity, and we should get it again to do it. So yeah.
I'm sure if you asked the children 7 weeks ago whether they would ever have played a musical instrument, I think the answer would have been no. I think if they'd have been asked, would they ever be able to play a musical instrument, if within 7 weeks if been taught, they would have said no. The self-belief and the self-esteem that the children have developed or improved on, we've noticed it each week.
I think a lot of the time at schools, you feel like, especially with music, you think you've got to get the bit of paper or the grade or whatever, whereas this just bypasses all that. It's just like, just make a sound, join our band, we'll do a performance.
It's music for fun.
Music for fun, yeah.
What it's supposed to be.
Which is exactly, which a lot of the time I think music education can go a little bit too formal, so we try and bring the informal. We don't know how to do formal.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Sophie, and really inspiring to see that video at the end there as well. I think we've got time for just one quick question. So Rachel asks, how has this project been affected by COVID?
Yeah, it did get affected. I mean, for our evaluation, that got curtailed because one school we didn't manage to go into for the observations because it hit in March, and so we weren't able to do that. Kate was able to keep in contact with the children because obviously these being very vulnerable children, it was felt important that that contact would be retained. So Kate's currently working on a logo project with the children. So it's possible to drop materials off, and in some instances use Zoom to connect with the children, and then just building towards what can come next. So Kate's hoping, COVID permitting, after Christmas to set up an after-school club for the children to keep this social capital going, to keep this fellowship alive. But yeah, it has been a challenge.
Brilliant. I'm aware of time and the need to move on to our final presentation. We've got a lot of questions that have come in, so maybe this is something we can return to in a general discussion at the end. But thanks a lot, Sophie. So now, finally, we have a presentation by Egil Rakashiva with co-author Anna Cohen-Miller from Nazarbayev University, Kazakhstan. And this presentation is called Teaching Research Methods with Body Mapping, Innovative Research Methods to Facilitate Natural Interaction and Open-Mindedness. Thanks, Egil.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having us out today. My name is Aygul, and I am research assistant at Kazakhstan Educational Research Association. And this is where Dr. Anna would have introduced. So I will pretend to be her as she is on medical leave for an emergency with her son. So Anna Cohen-Miller is a faculty member in the Graduate School of Education at Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan, Central Asia. And I'm her former student and alumni from NUJC. Adam, could you, next slide, please.
Okay, can we move to the next slide, please?
Yes, the next slide, please. So today I will be talking about creating inclusive spaces for teaching research methods with body mapping. I will discuss the innovative art-based method as it means to facilitate natural interaction and open-mindedness with student, participant, and researchers.
I think we're just having a momentary technical issue.
Thank you. As I said, I will be talking about creating inclusive spaces for teaching research methods, and I will present these presentations from the words of both of us. And could you please, next slide, please? Yes. So a few years, Dr. Anna created a research methods course, which is an elective course on innovative research methods to address complicated and contemporary questions in higher education. Our presentation today will draw from the work within that course she taught, the pedagogical approach and the collaboration. I will take over and lead you through our path today, drawing from my experience as a student, alumni, participant, and researcher. As an overview of the course, again, it was innovative research methods, and in that graduate level course was focused on a cultural relevant theme for students in Kazakhstan to examine what are Kazakhstani cultural values. We used multiple different research methods exploring various types of innovative methods, including art-based research with focus on body mapping. Next slide, please. From 2017 to today, a collaboration has taken place where Dr. Anna collaborated with me and my peer Nurlugul Smat in researching about body mapping as an inclusive pedagogical tool and research approach in higher education, and also in writing and presentation about the topic. Next slide. Before we go any further, let's pause briefly and take a moment to think about the types of art-based research methods that you have used in your research and or your pedagogical practice. So could you please write them all down? And I will wait a little bit. Around it here, yes, thank you. Nice. Observational, yes. Thank you very much for your commitment. I will go further and we discuss about it soon. Could you please turn to the next slide? I would like to start my presentation with a quote by Bayek: "Art is beyond words and offers alternative forms of messaging." And I would like to add that art offers alternative forms of messaging in research and pedagogy as well. Why? Because I think that it's not about just creativity. Art-based research reduces the dependence on verbal communication, which makes it for studying sensitive topics that are difficult to formulate verbally. Using the arts as a pedagogical tool has clear potential for research as well as in the classroom, such as in early childhood learning, for example. The arts can provide a tool for teaching and learning and for methodological purposes to help engage and enable the voice of participants and students. Next slide. In the course of innovative research methods, one of the art-based methods called body mapping drew our particular attention. Body mapping is a qualitative research method in which each participant makes a life-size drawing or painting of their own body. After making an outline, they fill in this body map with images, symbols, and words. By the end, they've created an image that represents multiple aspects of their embodied experience and their unique view of life. Next slide, please. Since its origin, Gastaldo notes that the practice has been used in various contexts, various countries, interpretations, and disciplines. Body mapping has been used in occupational health, for example, applied in studies comparing female identity and the concept of reproductive systems. Later, in a workshop in South Africa, this method was used to voice the experience of HIV positive people, decrease stigma, and advocate for the provision of antiretroviral medication. Next slide. Our expectation with body mapping began from one day when we came into the classroom and saw large sheets of paper in the floor and colored pencils. We were a class of 11 people divided into 3 or 4 students. Each group was asked to create a story scenario that might occur in most of the Kazakhstani families, something that causes some tension in families, like when there is a big decision or where individual members might disagree because of their generation or cultural beliefs. Each group created a scenario and added questions related to the key point of tension, climax, and of the story scenario. Each group created a scenario that was then passed to another group. In this way, a new group could encounter a fresh idea and consider how they would answer it. Using these scenarios, each group chose who was the main hero of the story and then drew his or her body map. The questions were answered by drawing on these body maps. There were 3 scenarios created, all addressing relevant issues to our lives. Next slide, please. So 3 big body mapping emerged, and we enthusiastically began to explain our scenarios and explain the questions that our classmates had developed for us to respond to. These scenarios were accessible and straightforward, natural way to talk about our culture. Next slide. In the first scenario, it's about a young woman who had just gotten married and her father-in-law interferes with her house chores, constantly criticizing and telling her how to cook, clean, and take care of other house. In more traditional cultural values, elders are respected and not argued with, creating a major conflict in roles and expectations for young women. The student researcher group posed these questions. How does a young woman react to it? How does she feel? And what are the next steps she takes? In the body map, the students described the various drawings, emblems, and colors. For example, she is wearing a skirt with traditional Kazakh patterns. She has a black knot on her throat, making it hard for her to speak, and a row leading to it from her heart, which is both red and black, showing her deep struggle and emotional pain. The next slide, please. The second scenario draws from the traditional Kazakh practice where girls are kidnapped and forced into marriage. Also not accepted throughout all of Kazakhstan. In more cultural and rural and traditional parts of the nation, this type of practice, bride kidnapping, still exists. The student researcher group posed following questions. How does the boy feel? What does he decide about what to do regarding his fiancé? How does the girl feel? How does the parents feel? In the body map, the students tried to show the attitude of different people to this situation. For instance, the parents' serious expression with clouds and X drawn above their heads demonstrates their need to maintain the proper image to others and to retain their position. Also, the hearts of the boy and the girl are divided into 2, broken and unhappy. Their faces are drawn with dark clothes showing anger and sadness, while the parents are serious. The characters' physique shows how men and women are seen in our culture. Boys are masculine and strong, girls are feminine and weak. Next slide, please. And the third scenario is about married woman who has to deal with studies and responsibilities of traditional daughter-in-law. This scenario further draws on expectations of women in Kazakhstani culture. While there is a growing number of women entering graduate school in Kazakhstan, according to OECD report, there remains an expectation for them to work a double or triple shift. In other words, women are allowed to attend graduate school as long as they can find a way to maintain a household work. One of the common traditions and expectations for family revolve around unexpected visitors. The final student researcher group posts these questions. What does Alma feel? What does a guest feel? What does Alma's husband feel? What should Alma have done? What should husband have done? What should their relatives have done? Should the drawing of the main through the drawing of the main character and surrounding husband, children, and relatives, the students wanted to show her position and her feelings. For example, the woman who feels herself as a bomb in a box. This phrase was given by students because the main character has to deal with many things, and she is exhausted, might get exploded, the same as the bomb, but it is in a box because she tries to bury it deep. In the body map, the woman is holding her head because she is having a headache because of her old problems and her family and task at the university. Her hair is messy. Students explained it with the phrase, her hair is screaming, which something is said when a person is so tired, whether it is emotionally or physically, and he or she doesn't care about the condition of hair much, which might be messy. This tells us that the woman is tired. However, the conclusion made by students is open. Bombs in a box. Do you know? You don't know whether it would explode or not. So from these examples, you can see the sensitive nature of the topics at hand about the role of parents, about in-laws, gendered violence, and cultural obstacles and major stress. Body mapping appears to create a way for students to share on such topics, ones that wouldn't normally emerge in a research methods class. Instead, they shared about their own experience and also about learning of other people's lives. Thank you. Next slide, please. What we started the experiencing of using body mapping within the classroom as a way to encourage an inclusive environment for sharing and learning about sensitive topics. We come back to the topics you shared earlier, the ways in which you have used art-based methods. Could body mapping be used for the topics you are explored previously? How could body mapping address other topics, intergenerational relations, political, personal, and social issues, people's life stories, working conditions, treatment information, and particularly relevant topic student experience during a pandemic? Next slide. In summary, in our experience, body maps can be used as a useful pedagogical and methodological tool to help students feel comfortable when discussing sensitive issues like, for example, long-standing cultural issues, tense institutional issues like a lack of support for graduate student mother scholars, to encourage accessible discussion of culture, or to facilitate understanding of lesser heard or marginalized stories, and to support students' collaboration. Next slide. What now for body mapping? Our next thought in moving forward with body mapping is thinking about how to adapt it. How can we adapt body mapping for creating inclusive online spaces, whether for research or teaching online, such as during quarantine? And also, how can we create inclusive online spaces for such use of art-based research without a typical face-to-face interaction? This is our main question for questions for today. And we would love your ideas on this. How can we adapt, for example, body mapping for research and also for teaching online? Next slide. So thank you so much for your time and attention. We look forward to your questions and thoughts, whether now or feel free to reach out us at any time. Thank you.
Thanks, Agil. That was a really fascinating presentation, and I'm quite interested in this idea of body mapping as a research method. How did you approach analysis of these body maps and the discussion around them?
Thank you for your question. Well, you know, this small research occurred in 2018 when we were graduate students, and we also participate as a participants and should draw these scenarios, should draw these body maps. And together with Dr. Anna, we created these scenarios and explained our ideas, our thoughts. And you know, it's a big deal for researcher to interpret correctly the ideas of students. We transcribed our discussions and then shared it with students, and they were agree about our interpretation. And sometimes it's difficult for body mapping or for other art-based methods to interpret correctly the ideas and the the source of participants. So we carefully studied all the information, all the sharings, and then described it on our work.
Thanks. And Beth asks, we've got time for one more quick question here. Beth asks, says great stuff, first of all, and then asks, how were these scenarios constructed?
Well, Dr. Anna divided us into three groups of 3 or 4 people, and then she asked to explain or to create a scenario about the most common traditional life situation in Kazakhstan, which is occur and which is like sensitive, or maybe some people don't like to speak about it and don't like to share about the situation. And we are all living in Kazakhstan, and you know, it's like some of sensitive topics that occurring every day, and we just explained in these 3 scenarios the most common topics in our daily lives, like bride kidnapping, that or like dealing with graduate studies, and like woman traditional housework. So this was our like intent to create these scenarios. And we also studied the question about what are Kazakhstani cultural values, how we can explain it.
Well, thanks a lot, Igor. Thanks for that wonderful presentation. And I'd now like to conclude by asking the other presenters to join us for a more open format discussion. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask that are for all the panelists together, more generally about arts education, I think that would be a great conclusion to this webinar. So perhaps we could start off by talking about some of the challenges going forward faced by arts education research. For example, teacher training bursaries for arts and humanities subjects, including English, are to be cut in the year 2021 to 2022. So it's clear that there are still some challenges going forward, but which, of course, as arts education practitioners and researchers, we're in a position to address. Would anybody like to comment on that?
I'd like to say that I think that an arts approach to education is of vital importance. I was looking at the video that Sophie put up about the project in Darlington, and looking at the flowering that was going on with those children. You know, how they were just starting to bloom, and if you take that away, if you take that way of expressing and connecting with other people, you take away something that's really important to human development. So yeah, it should be in there. It should be built in as standard to to any kind of approach to state education, especially I think about the early years and Key Stage 1, because you only need to be able to take things so far, and the specialisms can go from there. But at the core in the early years, it's so important to get this right and get foundations laid. Every primary school teacher should have this in their toolkit.
Yes, some of the schools in Darlington that we worked with in the Intune project, they admitted they didn't have a single member of staff who had any expertise in music. So they had nobody to do anything with the children whatsoever.
Yeah, and I would imagine that those practitioners would have had a tough thing going at first, trying to get the children to use basic music skills to be together and play together. But they obviously really did start to get it. But why aren't we doing this earlier?
I think, sorry.
Excuse me.
Yeah, I think generally, I mean, it's always. We're constantly in the arts, aren't we? Constantly in the position of having to advocate and fight our corner and so on. And I don't think that will ever go away. I mean, it's perhaps felt more intense over the last few years. But I just think it's interesting that if we use the expertise we have from the arts to realise that even a minor gesture can affect things very, very subtly. And particularly at the moment where things are so pared back, where I mean, I'm just thinking in visual arts, materially, you have schools where the resources they're allowed to use are being restricted, classrooms where they're only allowed to use a pencil and paper, for example, and all those other amazing resources are locked away in the cupboard and so on. That the amazing thing about the arts is that almost those restrictions become an opportunity to rethink. So not to put aside the kind of the awful need to always be advocating and fighting for the arts and more of it, but actually on the ground a strategy of realizing that a minor gesture can make a huge amount in a classroom in a school where there is no music and no art. A sound becomes incredibly effective and powerful. In more so sometimes than if we kind of got so much noise, so much sensation, so much going on that it's really hard to make an impact and to be noticed. So I think there's a real challenge for arts educators, whether specialists or not, in school, to take up the challenge to be effective, to do things at the moment, particularly when there's so much emphasis on the knowledge curriculum, it can be easy to get so caught up with that and not actually just do something that creates noise, that creates texture, that just makes the school a really interesting place to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's the interactive process, and I was absolutely fascinated to listen to Laura talking about what it was like, because I've been in prisons myself a couple of times. It was just wonderful hearing your description. And then these folk are sort of being taken seriously, and suddenly their humanity comes out.
Some of them for the first time in their life, not even just since being in prison. And that's the thing, isn't it? We're talking about primary schools and we're talking about childhood and those opportunities to engage creatively with things. And actually, if we take these away, whatever trajectory these young people now are on, where does that put them down the line, and what could they have gained from that? It's so powerful. I think the government campaign as well recently, and the public response to that has been the Retrain in the Arts campaign. The public response to that has been really interesting and really powerful in terms of kind of seeing what our governmental attitude is towards the arts, and actually seeing how the arts are fighting back and going, actually, no, stop devaluing this amazing, incredible work that is happening in the world and look at what it can do.
Well, I wish we've had so many questions that have come in, and I wish we were able to continue with this discussion and address all of these questions. Dior tells me that we can follow this up with a podcast or a blog for the questions. So I think that will be a next step. We've got all of these questions that have been asked here, and I think it would be great to continue this discussion. Yes, sorry, Lindsay. Yeah,
I was just bursting to ask Igor about the response when you got people to do these body maps. Did it change the participants in any way? What did you observe with them?
Well, you know, our participants were my group mates, and the reason is that I haven't find any like new thoughts about them because I already known them for 2 years, and but it was interesting to explore their ideas and feelings about our situations, because you know, in Kazakhstan living more than 130 representatives of different cultures, and my classmates also comes from different regions and different cultural backgrounds, and it was just interesting to see the attitude of participants towards the, for example, kidnapping in Kazakhstan, because it's more occurred in Kazakh families, or for example about sharing housework course of women in Kazakhstan. So you know, it's like a tool for creating an atmosphere, even with sense of humor and optimism about talking different serious problems that is for example in Kazakhstan. So we have found that body mapping helped us to listen and to give people a chance to speak about these topics that are sensitive, and no more people wants to share about it on our daily life.
Brilliant. Well, thanks a lot. Thank you. And just to very quickly.
Put him back on.
Firstly, myself and Laura as conveners, along with Jill of Arts-Based Education Research, have put together a survey on the effects of the COVID-19 lockdown and the ongoing pandemic on arts education. We do hope that you will follow this survey, follow this link to complete the survey, which should take 10 to 15 minutes of your time. We've had some brilliant responses so far, and that will really help us to understand.
That link's not quite right, so we'll get it emailed out to you after.
Okay.
That's only half the URL.
Thanks. Secondly, I mean, you can also, it's been shared by Bera's Twitter as well, so you can find it through Bera's Twitter page. So just to conclude, thanks to Bera for hosting this event. Thanks, Dior, for all your wonderful work in helping to organise and manage this webinar. Thanks to all our speakers. We had some wonderful presentations from across the UK and of course internationally as well. And thanks to all of you for taking part and for your wonderful questions. And we will, of course, follow this up with a podcast, blog, so please watch this space for that. So thanks a lot.